Case File 112, Species Human, Initial Assessment, Metabolically and neurally ceased. Final assessment, still prefers his coffee black. Every certainty is a measurement taken of yourself and mistaken for a law. The Ilmarek were not cruel. Hold on to that, because everything that follows will tempt you to let it go. They were the finest physicians in the trade lanes, and they had earned it the slow way, over 9,000 years of careful hands and careful records. They did not guess. They did not hurry. When an Ilmarek clinician told a family that the thing on the slab was no longer a person, that family could take the word to any court on any station in the Reach, and no one would ask them to prove it twice. They had a protocol for it. 47 revisions, each one written in the wake of some small error that had cost them, each one narrowing the gap between what they believed and what was true, until the gap was gone, until there was no gap left, until a checklist could tell you, with the flat authority of arithmetic, that a life had ended. Their criteria had never failed them. Their criteria could not fail them, because their criteria had been written by looking inward and describing what they found there, and then calling the description a law. And on the 9th hour of a shift that no one logged as remarkable, in a quiet room on a transit station called Threnodel Reach, the Ilmarek held a human being up against themselves, found nothing in him that any honest test of theirs could call alive, and sealed the record. They were not lying. They were not lazy. They were not careless, and they were not cold in any way that mattered. They were, by every standard they possessed, correct. This is the story of the day the galaxy learned that its cleanest, coldest, most certain word was only ever a guess made in the dark. The room they called the quiet word was never truly quiet, and Ilvayan Sar had long ago stopped noticing the sounds that made it so. The recyclers hummed in the walls at a pitch just below hearing, a pressure you felt in the sinuses rather than the ears. The lights were a soft blue-white that never flickered, never dimmed, never gave anyone in that room the mercy of a shadow. The floor was a yielding polymer that swallowed footsteps whole, so that his juniors seemed to arrive beside him without ever having walked. The patient that shift was a Doanu freight pilot, a long gray creature with fluted breathing spines, whose ship had opened itself against a docking spar. There had been nothing to do for her from the first minute. Ilvayan had known that from the first minute. He had done it all anyway, in order and slowly, because the doing was the point. He lowered his voice as he began. He always did. Not one of his students had ever asked him why, and he had never told them that the last examination of a person is a technical act and a ceremonial one at the same time, and that a voice pitched for a room full of the living is an obscenity in a room where a life is being closed. The light clicked into the pilot's eye. No response. He touched the cornea. Nothing. He turned the great gray head, and the eyes rolled with it like stones in a bowl, and did not correct, and did not track, and did not care. Tulmith Rue read each result aloud from the holographic checklist as it came. Crisp, quick, in that clipped list rhythm the protocol officers all fell into, as though the words were being stamped rather than spoken. Absent, absent, absent. Metabolic rate below the viability threshold for the required continuous interval. Circulatory criteria met and held. Ilvayan let the silence sit a moment longer than the protocol required. That was his own addition. It was not in revision 47 anywhere. Then he took the cessation seal from its cradle. It was a heavy thing, cool in the hand, older than the station and older than the protocol it enforced, and the weight of it had shaped the tendons of his wrist over a lifetime the way a tool shapes the hand that carries it. Neural and metabolic cessation confirmed, he said. Record sealed under Protocol 47. Click. In 1100 sealings, no record of his had ever been opened again, and Ilvayan Sar had never once imagined that it could be. 9 decks below, in the cold tier, Thomas Arden was arguing with a coolant line. It was not much of an argument. The line was winning, the way it had been winning for 6 weeks, weeping a thin fog out of a seam that his instruments insisted was intact. He worked the seam with his thumbs through the gloves, feeling for the flaw the way you feel for a splinter in someone else's hand, and the cold came up through the deck and into his knees and stayed there. Threnodel Reach kept its cold tier at a temperature the Ilmarek considered efficient and everybody else considered a punishment. Frost stood in furred gray ridges along the conduit brackets. When Tom moved, the frost cracked, a small dry sound like someone stepping on a moth. The whole tier smelled of nothing at all, which was itself a smell, The flat scoured nothing of air that had been through the scrubbers so many times it had forgotten it was ever outside. He had been out here 9 years. He was 44, and had the hands of a man of 60, and the patience of a man who had long ago run out of anywhere else to be. At the end of every hour he stopped. He sat back on his heels, he pulled off one glove with his teeth, and he unscrewed the cap of a dented steel thermos that had come out here with him and had never once been left behind. The coffee inside was terrible. It had been terrible for 9 years. It was a station-issue substitute pressed from something that had never met a bean, and he drank it black because the substitute for the cream was worse than the substitute for the coffee, and because after a while a man's preferences stop being preferences and start being the last few things about him that nobody else gets a vote on. He drank. The steam went up past his face and turned to nothing in the air. Then he screwed the cap down tight, the way he always did, and stepped back into the cold. Sethi found him there in the 11th hour, because Sethi found everyone everywhere. She was the smallest thing on the station with a rank tab, an Ilmarek juvenile apprentice to the quiet word, and she had been sent down with an inventory tablet and instructions to count brackets. She had counted 9 of them and then stopped counting, because the human was sitting on an overturned crate with his hands wrapped around something that was steaming. "Why does it do that?" she said. Not quite a question. Ilmarek juveniles ask the way water arrives. "It's hot," Tom said. "Why is it hot?" He thought about that. "Because I like it hot." She came closer. She had never been warm from the inside. No Ilmarek had. Their bodies ran hot and burned everything they took the instant they took it, and heat came at them from the outside, from lamps, from vents, from the appalling ovens the other species called comfortable rooms. The idea of carrying warmth into yourself on purpose, of holding it, of it being yours for a while, that was as strange to her as a second heart. "Can I?" she said, and did not finish, because she was not certain what she was asking for. He held out the thermos, not the cup, the whole thing. She took it in both hands and made a sound she was embarrassed about for a long time afterward. "Don't drink it," Tom said. "It'd probably kill you, but you can hold it." She held it. The recyclers hummed. Somewhere down the tier a bracket ticked as it cooled. She turned it slowly in her hands, hunting for the place where the heat was strongest, and found it on the seam under the cap, and stopped there. Her whole body had gone still in a way she would not have recognized in herself. Ilmarek warmth was a thing that happened to you, from lamps, from vents, from other people's rooms. This one sat in her palms and did not go anywhere, and did not ask her for anything, and it was, she thought, the most patient object she had ever touched. "It's not very good," she said at last, with the terrible honesty of the young. "Is it?" "No," Tom agreed. "It's not." She did not know it yet, but that was the last time anyone aboard Threnodel Reach would hear Thomas Arden speak. What happened in the cold tier at the 13th hour took 90 seconds and does not need to be described. A coolant line that his instruments had insisted was intact stopped insisting. The seam opened. The tier, which had been a punishment, became something else, and the emergency bulkheads did exactly what they had been built to do, which was to seal that section and hold it sealed until the pressure equalized, and that took 4 hours, and Tom Arden was in there for all of them. They brought him up on a grav sled with frost standing in his eyebrows. That is the image Ilvayan Sar kept, not the man, the frost. It had formed in fine white ridges along the coarse dark hair above the human's eyes, and it had not melted, because there was nothing left in that face to melt it with. The quiet words monitors reached for the body and found nothing to report. No cardiac rhythm, no respiratory effort, no neural activity above the noise floor of the instrument itself. Tulmith Rue read the core temperature aloud in his clipped stamping voice, and the number was so far outside the Ilmarek scale that the display rendered it in a color reserved for equipment faults. Someone at the back of the bay said, softly, that the machine must be wrong. "The machine is not wrong," Ilven said. "The machine is simply not required." He meant it kindly. He meant that they were past the part where numbers helped. He meant that when a body comes to you like this, you do not need the instruments to tell you, you need only your hands and your eyes and the protocol was already unfolding in his mind, calm and complete and utterly certain, the way a hymn unfolds in the mind of someone who has sung it 1,100 times. Ilvan Sar looked down at the frost still standing in the human's eyebrows and began. He lowered his voice. He slowed his hands. The light clicked into the human's eye, and the pupil did not move. He touched the cornea with the fiber. Nothing. He turned the head, heavy, colder than the room, the neck resisting like a hinge that had been left out in weather, and the eyes stayed exactly where they had been put. Two things registered, and both were filed wrong. The first was Tulmeth's, and it was a small administrative irritation rather than a thought. He had the core temperature, he had said it aloud twice, and there was nowhere on the holographic checklist to put it. Revision 47 asked for reflexes, for metabolic rate, for circulatory criteria, for the interval, for the seal. It had a field for the patient's species. It had a field for the examiner's rank. It had no field for how cold the patient was, because in 9,000 years of Ilmarek medicine that had never once been a question that changed an answer. Tulmeth held the number in his mouth for a moment, found no aperture for it, and swallowed it. The second was Ilvain's, and it was smaller still. The jaw was shut. Not slack, shut, the teeth set hard against each other, the muscle at the corner of the mandible standing out like a knot in rope. Ilvain noted it, and his mind produced the word stiffness, and the word fit, and so he did not look at it again. Every corpse he had ever handled had gone rigid in its own dialect. He assumed the human was speaking one he had not yet learned. He did not consider, because there was no reason in all the universe for him to consider it, that a jaw does not clench. A jaw is clenched. It is a thing a person does, and goes on doing, and will go on doing for as long as there is anything left in them that wants to. He completed the examination. He waited out the interval. He waited a little past it, as he always did. Then he took the cessation seal from its cradle, and he said the words, and he pressed it down. The click was a very small sound. It would be the loudest thing any of them remembered for the rest of their lives. Afterward, the room changed the way that room always changed. The monitors were muted first, because the protocol required it, and because no one could bear them otherwise, that idiot patient chirp of an instrument still faithfully reporting nothing at all. Then the ventilator mask came away. Then the overhead field was stepped down from clinical to ceremonial, blue going bluer, and the bay filled up with a silence that was not the absence of sound, but a sound in its own right. The recyclers, the coolant, the pressure below hearing, the great slow breath of a station that had not noticed. The juniors moved differently in it. They always did. Their steps got shorter, and their hands got tidier, and their voices, if they used them, came out at a pitch just above a whisper, and none of them could have told you why. Sethi came in with the personal effects from the cold tier in a gray tray. There was not much. A glove with the thumb worn through, a toolbar, a wallet card with a picture on it, worn white at the corners from riding in a pocket for 9 years, and the thermos. She set the tray on the side table beside the slab, because that was where trays went, and she went to take her hands away and did not. She looked at it. Dented steel. Cap screwed down tight. Then she put her fingers flat against its side, the way she had put them there 11 hours ago while a man watched her do it and said, "Don't drink it, it'd probably kill you, but you can hold it." It was warm. Not much. But it was warm, and nothing in that room was supposed to be. Tulmeth Rue filed the record at the top of the following hour, standing at the protocol station with the holographic checklist unfolded around him in its layers, and he did it perfectly, and it took him 4 minutes longer than it should have. Because the number would not go anywhere. He had it written on the back of his hand. He had written it there in the bay without deciding to, the way you sometimes find you have done a thing your hands thought was important. And he moved through the checklist, field by field, species and rank and reflex and interval, and each field took what he gave it, and none of them wanted the number, and at the end of it the record was complete and sealed and correct, and there was still a figure on the back of his hand that no part of Ilmarek medicine had ever asked for. Voice of the seal, he said. Ilvain was at the console with his back to him, putting the seal into its cradle, and he did not turn around. Officer, there's no field for it. Tulmeth heard his own voice come out wrong. Too fast, too high, the checklist rhythm broken. The temperature. There's a field for what species he is, and a field for who examined him, and there's no field for how cold he was. And I have said it aloud 3 times now, and it has not landed anywhere, and I want to know why a number that changes nothing keeps needing to be said, Yoenquate. The recyclers hummed. Sir, Tulmeth added, forgive me, sir. That, Ilvain said without turning, is unsealed thinking. Do not say it again where the juniors can hear you. The cooling annex was 3 doors down and 11 degrees colder, and it had been built that way on purpose, because the Ilmarek had learned very early that a body kept cold keeps its dignity longer than a body kept warm. They moved him at the 2nd hour after the sealing, 4 of them on the count, because that was how it was done. Never 3, never 5, 4 hands to a side, and the count spoken aloud by the most junior person present, so that no one senior could be accused of hurrying it. Sethi gave the count. Her voice cracked on the 2nd number, and nobody said anything about it. The slab in the annex was a smooth polymer that went faintly adhesive under contact, so that a body settled onto it stayed exactly where it had been put, without straps, without anything that looked like restraint. Ilvain had always been proud of that detail. It was a small mercy, and it was invisible, and it was the kind of thing you only build into a room if you have thought seriously about what it is like to be a family standing in a doorway. The coolant pump circulated in the walls with a soft, irregular knocking, like something patient asking to come in. Position, Ilvain said. Tulmeth adjusted the human's left arm a fraction so that it lay flat. It moved stiffly, and it stayed where he put it, and he took his hands back a little faster than he needed to. Interval, Ilvain said. Observation interval satisfied at the bay. Record sealed. Effects logged. Tulmeth's voice found its rhythm again, and Ilvain was glad to hear it. Repatriation request filed with the human registry. Their nearest courier is 9 days out. 9. They are not a well-served species out here, sir. Ilvain looked down at the man on the slab. 44 years old, the registry said, which for a human was somewhere near the middle. Frost gone now. Just a face, dark-haired, unremarkable, the mouth still shut in that hard particular way. He almost said something. He did not know, then or later, what it would have been. It never got as far as words. It was a pressure behind his teeth, a sense that the room contained one more fact than he had accounted for, and he had performed 1,100 sealings, and not one of them had ever left him with a fact in his mouth that had nowhere to go. Sir? Tulmeth said. Nothing. Close it. The annex took him the way the annex took everyone, and the door side shut, and the cold went on doing what the cold does. The effects bin was a chute in the wall outside the annex, and it went to a locker, and the locker went to whatever courier came, and that was the whole of the ceremony. Ilmarek do not keep the objects of the dead. The record is closed, the bed is cleared. There is a cleanness to it that other species find monstrous, and that the Ilmarek find kind. Sethi stood in front of the chute for 19 minutes, with a gray tray in her hands. The glove went in. The toolbar went in. The wallet card she looked at for a while, a human female and 2 juveniles on a shore somewhere, under a sky, squinting, and then that went in too, and she felt something in her chest fold over on itself, and she filed it away to think about when she was older. The thermos she could not do. Her hands would not perform the motion. She stood there and instructed them, and they declined, and she was young enough to find this genuinely astonishing. That was where Tulmeth found her. Apprentice. Officer. That goes in the chute. I know. Then. He stopped. He was 22 Ilmarek years old, and he had been a protocol officer for 4 of them, and he had never in his life had to say a thing twice to a junior. He tried it in the checklist voice, which was where he went when he was uncertain, the way another man might reach for a railing. Effects are logged, sealed, and chuted. There is no field for exceptions. The bin does not care what the object is. It's warm. Tulmeth's spines flattened. What? It's warm, Sethi said. It was warm 11 hours ago when he gave it to me, and it was warm 4 hours ago on the side table, and I have checked it every time I have walked past it, and it is still, right now, a little bit warm, and I do not understand how. Because everything in that room is the temperature of that room. That is what a room does. That is what a room is for. It is insulated, Tulmeth said. It is a vessel built to hold heat. It is holding heat. That is not a mystery, that is a thermos. Yes, Sethi said. Yes. All right. Yes. She looked at the chute. Officer, she said, can I ask you something, and not have it be unsealed thinking? No, said Tulmeth Rue honestly. Is he cold? Sethi asked, or is he dead? Because those are the same word in your language, and I don't think they're the same word in his. Ilvain Sar did not go off shift. He told the roster he was completing the record. The record had been complete for 6 hours. He sat at the protocol station on its raised platform with the holographic checklist folded down to a single dim line, and the quiet word hummed around him, and the cessation seal sat on the console under his right hand where he had set it down. There is a story the Ilmarek tell their students exactly once, early, and then never again. The way you show a child the edge of a drop so that they will keep away from it for the rest of their lives without needing to be told. 4,000 years ago, there had been a clinician named Orenth Val, and Orenth Val had sealed a record, and 11 days later that record had been opened. Not by him, by the courts, by a family, by a machine somebody else built that saw something his criteria had not been written to see, and the thing his criteria had called finished had turned out to be a person in the middle of a very long and very quiet process of not dying. The patient did not survive. That was never the point of the story. The point of the story was Orenth Val, who lived another 60 years, and who never sealed again, and who is remembered by name in a profession that deliberately remembers no one, because the Ilmarek do not fear death, and do not fear failure, but they fear, with a purity that has organized 9,000 years of their medicine, the moment when a certainty has to be taken back in front of the people who trusted it. Ilvain had been shown that story at 19. He had understood it immediately. He had built his entire life against it, brick by careful brick, the slow hands, the lowered voice, the extra silence past the interval that was not in revision 47 anywhere, all of it a wall between himself and Orenth Val. What nobody told the students, and what Ilvain had worked out for himself somewhere around his 40th year, was that the story is not a warning about carelessness. Orenth Val was not careless. Orenth Val was, by every account that survives, the most careful clinician of his generation, and that was the whole of the horror. He had done it correctly. He had followed a protocol that was, at that hour, the finest instrument his people possessed, and the protocol had returned an answer, and the answer had been false, and there had been no error anywhere in the chain for anyone to find and fix. There was only a gap between what the Ilmarek were and what the universe contained, and Orenth Val had happened to be standing in it. You cannot build a wall against that. You can only build a wall against the idea of it, and hope the gap is somewhere else. He looked at the seal. It was a beautiful object, cool, heavy, 9,000 years of not being wrong, resting in the shape it had worn into his palm. He set the seal down on the console and, for the first time in his career, did not put it away. The 6th hour, Thomas went back into the annex, because he had told himself he was checking the slab telemetry, and because a protocol officer is permitted to check slab telemetry, and because at that particular moment in his life, he needed to be a person who was permitted to do the thing he was doing. The annex was blue and cold and knocking softly. He pulled the telemetry. Slab load, stable. Ambient, stable. Surface temperature of the body, rising. He read it 3 times. Rising. Not much. 0.2 of a degree across 6 hours, in a room held 11 degrees below the bay, which was a thing that rooms did not permit and bodies did not do. A body in a cold room goes to the cold room. That is not medicine, that is arithmetic. He checked the ambient again. He checked the pump cycle. He put his own palm flat against the slab a meter from the human's shoulder and felt nothing but polymer and cold. He stood there with his hand on the slab and the knocking of the pumps going on, and he did not have a word for what he was feeling, so his body gave him one. His spines came up, all of them, the whole ridge, the way they had not done since he was a juvenile in the dark. He went and found Ilvain at the station. Surface temperature, he said, in the annex, it's rising. Ilvain did not look up from the dim line of the checklist. By how much? 0.2. Across? 6 hours. Instrument tolerance in that room is 0.3. Tolmeth opened his mouth, closed it. He knew the tolerance. He had known it before he walked in. He had walked in anyway, and he understood, standing there, that he had not come to report a number. He had come to be told that the number was nothing, and that the senior had just done exactly that, and that it had not helped at all. Sir, the direction of it. Cold rooms lie, Ilvain said. Log it as condensation, and Tolmeth Rue, who would spend the rest of his life remembering that he obeyed, logged it as condensation. Sethi went into the annex at the 9th hour, off shift, out of uniform, without permission, which meant that if anyone found her there, she would be finished before she had started. She went anyway. She brought the thermos. The room was dim and blue and very cold, and she had never once in her life been alone with a body. That was not a thing juniors did. The dead were moved by 4, on the count, and were never left with anybody because there was nothing left to be with. She sat down on the floor beside the slab with her back against it. "They're going to make me put your cup in the chute," she said. The pumps knocked. Nothing else happened, which was the only thing that had ever happened in that room. "It's a 9-day wait for your people. Officer Rue says you're not a well-served species. I looked you up. You've only had a registry office out here for 2 years, and it's one person, and she's on a different station." She turned the thermos over in her hands. "I don't know why I'm telling you the administrative situation. I don't know what else to tell you. Nobody teaches us how to talk to you." "There's no point," is the reasoning. "There's no—" She stopped. "There's no field for it," she said. She thought about the human sitting on an overturned crate in a corridor cold enough to break frost off the brackets, holding out the whole thermos, not the cup. "Don't drink it. It'd probably kill you, but you can hold it." He had not had to do that. She had run the calculation 40 times looking for what he had wanted from her, and there was nothing. There had never been anything. He had been a tired man on his 11th hour who saw a child looking at a warm thing and gave her the warm thing, and that was all, and it turned out that that was enormous. The warmth in the steel was very faint now. She could only find it under the cap. Then she could not find it anywhere. She sat with the thermos in her lap until it was as cold as everything else in the room, and then she cried, which was not in any protocol she had ever been given. At the 14th hour, the quiet word took a hull-side casualty and a birth complication in the same 40 minutes, and the annex slab was needed, and so the thing happened that saved Thomas Arden's life. It was not a decision. Nobody deliberated. A support technician whose name does not appear anywhere in this account pulled the repatriation notice, read that the courier was 9 days out, read that the annex was rated for 4 bodies and currently held 1, read that the incoming casualty was Doenu, and that Doenu tissue degrades in ways that Ilmarek and human tissue do not, and applied the standing rule, which was that the annex goes to whoever needs it most. So they moved the human out, 4 of them on the count, 3 doors and a turn, into the holding corridor, a long warm passage on the station's inner ring where the recyclers ran their exhaust, humid, 26 degrees, distant with the noise of the concourse 2 decks up. It was not a medical space. It was a place where things waited. Crates waited there, equipment waited there, bodies waited there, on a gurney against the wall, when there was somewhere better for the cold to be spent. It took 11 minutes. The technician logged it under Facilities Utilization, subcode 4, which is the code for moving an object to make room for a different object. Nobody wrote it down as a medical decision. Nobody wrote it down at all. It was a bed being cleared, and it saved his life. Tolmith found the utilization log at the 16th hour and went to the protocol station at a speed that was not appropriate for the quiet word. They moved him. Lavin was standing now. He had been standing for some time. The seal was still on the console. "Into the corridor," Tolmeth said. "The warm corridor, subcode 4. Sir, the surface temperature was rising in an 11-degree room, and now he is in a 26-degree room, and I want—" He stopped and started again, and could not make it come out as a list. "I want to know what the number was for. I have carried it for 16 hours. It is on the back of my hand. It has been on the back of my hand since the bay, and I have washed twice, and I keep writing it again. There is no field for it, and it will not leave, and I am asking you, as my senior, what it is for." The recyclers hummed. Somewhere down the ward a monitor chirped and was silenced. Ilvan turned around, and Tulmith Rue saw, for the first time in 4 years of standing beside this creature, that the voice of the seal was afraid, not of the number, not of the corridor, not of the human, of the question, of being asked it in a room with a door open. "Officer Rue," Ilvan said, "look at my sleeve." Tulmith looked. 11 layered seals, a career. Every one of those is a family who went home and slept. They slept because I told them a true thing in a clean voice, and they did not have to wonder. That is what the sleeve is. It is not status. It is the accumulated sleep of 1,100 families, and it is held up by exactly one thing, which is that we do not stand in our own wards asking each other whether the word we just used meant anything. He came down off the platform, 1 step, and his voice never rose, And that was somehow the worst part. You have said it 4 times. You have been answered 3. Sir, ask me once more, Ilvayan said gently, and I will open a new seal against your name. Tulmeth-Ru went to his quarters and sat on the edge of his rack for an hour with his hands hanging between his knees, and did not wash the number off. Ilvayan stayed at the station. He had 1,100 ceilings behind him and the muscle memory of every one of them, and his hands knew what to do at every stage of every one, and now his hands did not know what to do at all. He watched them, distantly, as if they belonged to a colleague. They went to the checklist, they went to the seal, they went to the seal again. Once, without any instruction from him, the right one performed the stamping motion against the empty console and made no sound, and he had to look away from it. At the 18th hour he stood up. He told himself he was going to the corridor to confirm the record, that there was a body in a facilities space under subcode 4, unattended, and that this was beneath the dignity of the quiet word, and that a senior clinician was entitled to go and see that a sealed patient was lying decently. All of that was true, every word of it was true, and it was a good reason, and it would have survived any review board in the Reach. He told himself he was going to the corridor to confirm the record. He was, at that moment, the only person on Threnodel Reach who did not know he was lying. The holding corridor was warm, and it was humid, and the air had a used, living smell to it, exhaust and bodies and the faint sweet rot of the recycler beds, and Ilvayan Sar hated it immediately, in a way he could not account for. The gurney was against the wall, between a crate of atmospheric filters and a stack of nothing in particular. 2 decks up, the concourse was in its evening. You could hear it, a wash of voices with no words in it, somebody's music, somebody's argument, a whole station's worth of people who did not know that a man had died today, because a station is too big for that to matter, and that is the mercy of stations. He stood there. Then, because there was nowhere else, he pulled over a crate and sat down on it, which no voice of the seal had done in the presence of a sealed patient in 9,000 years, and which no one saw, and which he never entered in any record. The human's face had changed in the warmth. The hard set of the mouth had softened. The knot at the corner of the jaw was gone now, smoothed away, and Ilvayan looked at that for a long time, and understood that he was watching the last of the cold leave a thing that had been cold, and that this was the ordinary physics of a body in a warm room, and that it meant nothing. He said, to no one, 9 days. The concourse noise rose and fell. Your registry has 1 officer for this entire arm, and she is not even on this station. 9 days for someone to come and take you, and in 9 days I will still be the person who says the word here, and I will still be right, and I would like. He stopped. He was talking to a body in a hallway. He put his hands on his knees. He made himself breathe the way he made his students breathe. There was a thermos, he remembered. It had been in the tray. He had walked past the tray 4 times, and he could describe the dent in it, which meant he had looked at it 4 times, which meant that some part of him had been keeping an inventory that the rest of him had not been told about. The apprentice had not chewed at it. He knew that too, and had known it for hours, and had not disciplined her for it, and had not asked himself why not. He was, he thought, becoming a man with a great many facts in his mouth. The concourse laughed at something, 2 decks up, all together, 400 people at once. Whatever had been Thomas Arden was quiet now, and Ilvayan Sar mistook that quiet, one last time, for the end of him. He did the exam again. He did not admit to himself that this was what he was doing. He told himself it was a courtesy, a decency, a senior clinician's last attention to a patient no one else would attend to. But his voice lowered by itself, his hands slowed by themselves. In a facilities corridor, on a crate, with no juniors present and no record open and nothing at stake at all, Ilvayan Sar performed the final examination of Thomas Arden the way he had performed 1,100 others, as a technical act and a ceremonial one at the same time. The light clicked, nothing. The cornea, nothing. He turned the head, and it turned easily now, warm, loose, obedient, and the eyes rolled with it and did not correct, and did not track, and did not care. He laid the back of his hand flat against the human's chest, which is not in revision 47, which is not in any revision, which is a thing an Ilmarek clinician's ancestors did 4,000 years before there were protocols at all, when the whole of medicine was one person putting a hand on another person and waiting to see. He waited. The recyclers ran. The concourse murmured. Somewhere overhead, a station announcement went off in 3 languages, and none of them were human. He waited a very long time, well past the interval, well past his own famous extra silence, long enough that his hand went warm against the skin, and he could no longer tell which of them the warmth belonged to. Nothing came up to meet it. Ilvayan Sar took his hand back and closed the observation, formally, silently, to himself, in an empty corridor, and then he sat with it, the whole clean weight of a thing correctly done. The criteria had held, the record was true, the sleeve was true, every honest test he had performed twice, and the man on the gurney had failed all of them both times. He was, and this was the last thing Ilvayan Sar would ever be entirely certain of, dead. Sethi found him there. She should not have. She had come down to the holding corridor for the same reason she had gone into the annex, which was that she had a cold thermos in her hands, and nowhere in 9,000 years of Ilmarek medicine to put it. She came around the crates and stopped, because the voice of the seal was sitting on a packing crate in a facilities passage, with his sleeve of 11 seals and his hands on his knees, and there was no protocol on any station in the Reach that had a shape for that. "Sir," she said, "I'm sorry, I'll go." "Sit down, apprentice." She sat down, not on a crate, on the deck, cross-legged, with the thermos in her lap, because she was 13 and the deck was where she went. The recyclers breathed. 2 decks up, someone's music changed. "You did not shoot it," Ilvayan said. "No, sir." "Why?" She thought about lying. She was young enough to still be considering it as a technique rather than knowing it as a reflex. "Because he handed it to me," she said. "The whole thing, not the cup. He was cold and he was tired, and he was on his 11th hour, and I was standing there looking at it, and he just gave it to me. And there wasn't a reason. I've looked for hours, sir. I've been looking for what he wanted, and there isn't anything there. There's just a man in a freezing corridor giving a child the warm thing because she wanted to hold it." Ilvayan did not answer. "And I know that's not medicine," Sethi said. "I know it isn't a finding, but I keep thinking that we wrote a protocol out of ourselves, and it's a very good protocol, and it has 47 revisions, and there's no line in any of them for a person who does that." "It is not a finding," Ilvayan agreed. His voice had gone very low. "It is not a finding, and I have been sitting in a hallway for 2 hours because of it." They sat. The gurney was against the wall. The warm air moved. And Ilvayan Sar, voice of the seal, 1100 sealings, no record ever opened, looked at the human's face for what he intended to be the last time, and his eyes went, the way an old clinician's eyes go, without permission, following the training rather than the man, to the mouth, which had been shut since the cold tear. Shut through the sled and the bay and the light and the fiber and the click. Shut through the annex and the count and the chute. Shut in a room 11 degrees below the bay for 14 hours, and shut in a hallway for 4 more. And the knot at the corner of it had softened hours ago, and Ilvan had watched that happen and called it physics and been right. The jaw came open, and through the teeth that had been shut since the cold tear came a sound none of them had a word for, a breath. Nobody moved. That is the part the Ilmarek could never explain afterward, at any of the hearings, in any of the depositions, and it is the part that Sethi understood immediately at 13, and Tulmeth understood at 40, and Ilvayan understood on the day he died. Nobody moved, there was no shout, there was no scramble. 2 people sat perfectly still in a warm corridor and watched a dead man breathe, and did nothing at all, for 11 seconds, because the alternative to doing nothing was to accept that the last 9,000 years had contained a door. Then Sethi said, "Sir," and Ilvayan said, in a voice that came out of the checklist because there was nothing else left in him to speak with, "Instrument tolerance in that room is 3/10. Sir. Cold rooms lie. Sir. He's breathing." Ilvayan got off the crate and went down onto his knees on the deck beside the gurney, which is a thing that his body did and that he did not authorize, and he put the back of his hand flat against the human's chest, in the old way, the way from before the protocols. Something came up to meet it. It was small. It was appallingly slow. It was so far outside anything an Ilmarek heart could do, and remain a heart that his own body reported it as an error, a fault in his hand, a tremor of his own, and he held it there and made himself feel it and counted it, and the number he counted was not survivable, and it went on being not survivable, again, and then again, and then again, patiently, in the dark, without any interest whatsoever in what the Ilmarek considered possible. "Get Officer Rue," he said. Sethi did not move. She was crying. She had not noticed. "Apprentice," gently. "Go and get Officer Rue, and do not run, because if you run, people will follow you." She went. She did not run. It cost her something she never got back, and then a man who had been dead for 19 hours opened his eyes in a facilities corridor on Threnodel Reach and looked at the ceiling for a while, the way you do. It was not dramatic. That is the thing that none of the recordings ever captured, and none of the retellings ever got right. There was no gasp. There was no sitting bolt upright. What there was a long, slow, terrible piece of work. It took him 4 minutes to turn his head. His body did not want any of it. Everything in him had been shut down for 19 hours, and everything in him now had to be started again by hand. And it came back the way a station comes back after a power event, sector by sector, badly, out of order, with things failing that had never failed before. His hands shook so violently that Ilvayan had to hold the left one down against the gurney rail. His breath came in the wrong rhythm, and then no rhythm, and then, eventually, some rhythm. His eyes could not agree on where to look. Tulmith arrived at the head of 11 people and stopped in the mouth of the corridor, and none of them came any further, because Ilvayan had put a hand up, and because there are moments that a species knows to stand at the edge of. So that is the picture. 11 Ilmarek in a doorway. A protocol officer with a number written on the back of his hand. An apprentice on the deck with a cold steel thermos in her lap. A senior clinician on his knees. Every one of them enormous, gray, spined, built by 9,000 years of being right about death. And every one of them looking down at one small, shaking human being who was, by the best instrument their civilization possessed, not there. Tom Arden got his elbow under himself. It took him a very long time. Nobody helped him, because nobody knew how. There was no field for it. And he pushed himself up off that gurney by increments, an inch and a rest, an inch and a rest, until he was sitting, hunched, swaying, his head hanging, breathing like a man who has carried something up a very long hill. He looked at the room. He tried to speak, and nothing came. He tried again. A sound came out, and it was not a word. He waited. Then he tried a third time, and got it, and it came out cracked and slurred and quiet and completely unmistakably calm, the voice of a man on his 11th hour, in a corridor cold enough to break frost off the brackets, holding out the whole thermos and not the cup. "Coffee," he said. "Black, if the machine still works." Nobody said anything for a long time. Then Ilvayan Sar heard, behind him, a sound he had never heard from 11 adult Ilmarek at once, and it took him a moment to understand that it was breathing, that his people, all of them, had started breathing again at the same time, and that a great many of them were weeping, quietly, in the manner of a species that considers noise in a ward to be an obscenity. They did not bring the coffee, not yet. Somebody would within the hour, and it would take 4 of them to work out the machine, and that is a different part of this story. What happened first was the record. Ilvayan went back to the protocol station because the record was the only thing he had left that he knew how to touch. The holographic checklist unfolded around him in its layers, and there it was, complete and sealed and correct, and every field in it was true. Species, human, true. Absence of all species standard brainstem equivalent reflexes, confirmed, twice, by 2 examiners, in 2 rooms, 18 hours apart. True. Metabolic rate below the species viability threshold for the required continuous interval. True. Circulatory criteria met and held. True. Record sealed under Protocol 47. True. He stood in the middle of 9,000 years of not being wrong, and he could not find the error. There was no error. That was the thing that took his legs out from under him, there, in front of his ward. Not shame, not the sleeve, not Orenth Vol. It was that he went looking for the mistake so he could take responsibility for it, and there was nothing there to take. "Sir," Tulmith Rue was beside him. He turned his hand over, palm up, and held it there so the senior could see the back of it. The number was still written on it. He had been carrying it for 19 hours. "There's no field for it," Tulmith said quietly. "That's all it is, sir. That's all it ever was. It isn't that we made an error, it's that we built a room with no door in it, and then we spent 9,000 years telling each other there was nowhere else to go. and Ilvayan Sar, who had never once said it, said, the criteria were insufficient. Behind them, down the ward, someone was helping the human sit up straighter against a wall, because he could not sit unsupported, because he would not sit unsupported for a long time, because a body does not come back from that hole, and no one on that station ever pretended otherwise afterward. He knelt down again, which he had now done twice in one day, and which he did for the rest of his career. I sealed you, he said. Tom looked at him. It took some work to get the eyes to settle. I stood over you and I said the words and I pressed the seal, and I did every test my people have, and I did them twice, and I was. His voice, that beautiful low ceremonial instrument, came apart. 19 hours. You were in a shoot list. Your effects were in a bin. There is a child on my ward who sat on the floor of a freezer with your cup, and I told her officer it was condensation. End quote. The human's hands were shaking in his lap. He looked at them, mildly, the way you look at weather. Doctor, he said, and had to stop and breathe and start again. Doctor, do you know what we say? No. You weren't wrong, doctor. You were early. Where I'm from, nobody's gone until they're warm. They kept him on Threnodel Reach for 4 months, because he could not be moved, and then because he would not be. It was not a recovery in the way the retellings have it. He had to learn his own left hand again. He had to learn stairs. There were 3 weeks where he could not hold anything smaller than a bar, and a month where the words came out in the wrong order, and he knew it, and could not stop it. And he sat through all of it with the same flat patience he had brought to a coolant seam that was winning. The Ilmarek did not know how to be around it. They had never had a patient come back from the far side of their own vocabulary, so they invented a way, badly, out of nothing, and it looked like this. They were quiet, and they were slow, and they were there. Tulmeth Rue never washed the number off. It faded on its own, over 11 days, and by then it did not need to be on his hand, because it was in a field. He had built the field himself, in a proposal that would eventually be Revision 48, and the field asked one question that Ilmarek medicine had never thought to ask. How cold is this person, and is that a thing this person's body is allowed to do? The cessation seal stayed on the console. Ilvayan did not put it back in its cradle. He did not stop using it either. That is the part people get wrong. He sealed again, and he did it well, and 11 more families went home and slept. But it lived on the console now, out where the juniors could see it, and every apprentice who came through that ward for the next 30 years was told the same thing on their first day. That is the finest instrument we have ever built, and it is the shape of us, and it is not the shape of the universe, and you will remember the difference or you will not stand in this room. Sethi did not become a protocol officer. She went into cross-species physiology, which was not a field on Threnodel Reach until she made it one, and she was insufferable about it for 40 years. But that was later. What happened first, an hour after the corridor, while 11 Ilmarek stood in a doorway and did not know what to do with their hands, was that a 13-year-old apprentice went and got a dented steel thermos out of a gray tray beside a chute, and carried it down to a man sitting against a wall, and put it into his lap, because his hands could not have held it. He looked at it for a while, then he looked at her. You didn't shoot it, he said. No, Sethi said. There was no field for it. And Thomas Arden laughed, which took everything he had, and cost him 10 minutes of breathing afterward, and was the first laugh in the recorded history of the quiet word. Then he said, well, it's empty, and it's cold. Yes, she said. That's a fixable problem, he said. Outside, the quiet word hummed, and the recyclers ran. And somewhere down the corridor, a machine nobody had ever thought to write into any protocol began, slowly, to fill a cup. They were not wrong. That is what I want you to sit with. They were not lazy, and they were not cruel, and they did not cut a corner. And if you had been on that slab and I had been holding the light, I would have said the same word they said. So here is my question, and I would like you to leave it below, because I read them. If a rule you had trusted your whole life turned out to be right about everyone except one person, would you rewrite the rule or the person? Think about it, then tell me. And if you want the next case file, subscribe, because there are a great many of them and the shelves are long. The archive never forgets, neither should you.